So I'm happy that you're here. I've been trying to keep continuous engagement with alumnx just through my newsletter. I have all of these grand ideas, but life happens. So, so I'm just happy to see your faces and hear your voices and know that you're here because it means that you read something about this, which means that I'm doing something okay, right? So if before we get started, if you'd like to put in the chat box, I don't want to have us go through introductions because that can get lengthy, and I want us to be here to practice. So if you'd like, you can put in the chat box anything that will help you feel a little bit more connected to your Naropa community, where you're tuning in from, when you graduated, what your program was, whatever you want, if you'd like to. But before we do that, shall we start off with a bow?
Let's.
Wonderful. Now, I know that most of you know who our facilitator is, but it is still my pleasure to give you a little bit of an intro. Acharya Judith Simmer-Brown, PhD. She is recently retired as Distinguished Professor of Contemplative and Religious Studies at Naropa, where she has taught since 1978. She heads the Compassion Training Task Force for the Center for the Advancement of Contemplative Education at Naropa and serves as one of the compassion trainers. She and her husband, Richard, have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. So I will turn it over to Judith, and thank you so much.
Wonderful and delightful to see you all here today. I have retired from teaching at Naropa, but I continue on contract with Naropa for a variety of projects. So I do have an ongoing relationship. I'm just not in the classroom regularly. And the semester is just over. On Saturday will be winter graduation, and everyone is terribly relieved the semester is over because of the stresses of hybrid and online teaching. But I can tell you that our students were so grateful to be able to continue to study Naropa style, even in the midst of the pandemic. So I just wanted to bring you up to date a little bit about what's going on at Naropa. Many people like Stacy and myself and most faculty are working at home. Since Thanksgiving, everything has been online, and our campuses are quite deserted. There's been a little activity. The undergraduate programs have had more hybrid style and the graduate programs more online. But Naropa is doing well and continuing, and contemplative education works online as well as in person. For those of you who may know about the contemplative psychotherapy program, for example, they had Maitri. They had Maitri in person this fall. And in the springtime, they had a full Maitri week that was supposed to be a retreat, that a Maitri retreat completely online, and it worked. So we're working out to how to have our Naropa education in an ongoing way in a pandemic situation. And I know that many people are extremely grateful to have contemplative education at a time like this with COVID-19. We also have had regular contemplative offerings. Almost every morning, someone in the community offers a contemplative practice for members of the community. And so the commitment to contemplative practice and contemplative education is very much alive and well at Naropa. I was delighted when Stacy asked me to lead this session, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, we're going to do Tonglen practice together, but I wanted to start out by reflecting on the varieties of suffering that we're living in right now. When the Buddha gave his very first teaching 2,600 years ago, the teaching talked about suffering, and this word dukkha is an interesting word. And for those of you who've taken classes with me at Naropa, this may ring a bell, but The word dukkha, which we translate suffering, doesn't exactly mean suffering. Dukkha, ka refers to axle hole, the axle hole for a wheel. And of course, at the time of the Buddha, wheels were made by hand. And the key element about a wheel is the axle hole right in the middle of the wheel. Because if the axle hole is a little off, then it leads to a bumpy ride. And if it's spot on, directly in the middle of the wheel, then the ride is very smooth. And so the word dukkha means bad axle hole, meaning a little off center. And the word sukha, which is translated bliss or happiness, means good axle hole. So the wheelwright who drilled the hole for the axle had a huge responsibility to make a good axle hole, and that was extremely difficult to do. When the Buddha taught about dukkha, he was saying that when the axle hole is a little off, then everything feels like it's a little off. And that could be in dramatic ways, as in a pandemic, or it could be in subtle ways. So when we talk about dukkha, we're talking about things being a little off, producing anxiety, all kinds of fear, depression, various kinds of things. And the three categories of dukkha that the Buddha talked about were, and I wanted to reflect on those about in your own experience, in your own personal lives during the pandemic, what aspects relate to each of these three categories. The first one he talked about was physical suffering, the suffering of sickness, the suffering of being injured, sufferings associated with having a physical body, the suffering of old age and the changes in the body that come with old age, any kind of physical malady, physical injury, any kind of physical sickness. And so that covers all kinds of things, and obviously covers COVID and covers a lot of the experience of people who are in the hospital, who are at home, really trying to get through this illness. And the second kind of suffering that he talked about was psychological suffering. And psychological suffering means the various mental states that come. Even joy can be a temporary psychological suffering because we feel very upset when joy goes away. But psychological suffering especially relates to the very painful states of mind. And we find that in a time of COVID, there's so much fear and anxiety. There's so much frustration of various kinds. There's people around the United States who are literally protesting that they have to wear a mask. So there's a lot of anger and resentment and that kind of thing. There are many psychological states that people experience that are going on in our COVID world. And then the third kind of suffering is spoken of as existential suffering or all-pervading suffering. And it's the kind of underlying uncertainty of being a human being. It has to do with often the unnamed fears, just the sense of things just aren't the way they used to be. And we see that a lot in our society when people keep talking about, I'm tired of this pandemic. I want things to go back to normal. The underlying existential suffering has to do with fear of change, resistance to change. We have a hard time acknowledging that things will never go back to the way they were before. There's a new normal that has really dawned at this time. And I think the thing for us to acknowledge as we prepare to do Tonglen practice, and as we keep in mind these various kinds of suffering, people are affected by all three levels of suffering at the same time. The physical situation we're in, if we're in lockdown, or if we're in essential jobs or whatever, or if we are sick ourselves, the various physical difficulties, the psychological difficulties that also accompany the physical difficulties, and the existential things. So I wanted to invite you to put in the chat box the kinds of suffering that you particularly are wanting to work with today in the practice of Tonglen. Doesn't have to be your suffering. Could be the suffering of someone you know or of the community you live in. It could be suffering within your family or coworkers or workplace. The kinds of suffering that you'd like to have in mind today for our Tonglen practice. So could you put things in the chat box about that? And after our practice, we'll have a discussion about this. Physical suffering, my husband, myself, and my father. Other kinds of suffering, or you could unmute and just say psychological suffering. Yes, Sherry, psychological suffering, any particular kind of psychological suffering? The emotional toll of this pandemic on myself, my mother, and my clients. Oh my goodness. My son is a graduate of the Naropa contemplative psychotherapy program, and he is a therapist here in Boulder who works with mentally ill homeless addicts. And his clients are having so much a challenge right now. A physical suffering of a close friend who has COVID right now, and psychological suffering of my therapy clients. Yes. Lots of anxiety around here. Yes. Anger, my friends, clients, complaints, frustrations, resentments. Yes. Oh, you graduated with Owen, Jen. That's wonderful. I'll tell him you were here. That's great. Uh, Psychological suffering from witnessing the inequities of racial capitalism. Absolutely. Anger, frustration, confusion about what is real. Suffering due to drug addiction, a close relative of mine. Illness in the body, yes, Claire. Psychological suffering, my father has COVID and I'm concerned for his health, absolutely. But feel mostly helpless. It's hard to be separated when he's sick, absolutely. Around COVID and school and business shutdowns, suffering due to lack of access to healthcare and other resources, care for ill sibling with dementia. Oh yes, that's rough. Being a caregiver, such a challenging thing. And isolation and loneliness. Yes, these are all the kinds of suffering that we are inviting into the space as we practice together today. And as you practice, you may have new kinds of suffering come to mind that you'd like to invite into the space of your practice. One of the most beautiful things about Tonglen practice is that it is very energetic and non-conceptual. And so we don't need to think up things, although it's always good. When I start Tonglen, I start with a list of people I want to do Tonglen for, divided into chronic illness, serious terminal illness, people with psychological difficulties, people with circumstantial difficulties, so that I have something to start with. But the Tonglen practice beautifully morphs to different situations depending on what comes up in my mind. And I invite you to, as you do Tonglen practice together, that you feel ready to go to whatever suffering arises in your mind, your own or the suffering of others. So I'd like to get a sense, a show of hands. How many of you have, by a lot of you don't have your cameras on, how many of you have had Tonglen instruction before? Oh, Naropa students, alums, you're so great. You definitely have been exposed to, well, I like to think of Tonglen as its own positive pandemic. And I hope you carry this positive pandemic into your lives. So as a refresher, I'm going to be doing classic 4-stage Tonglen, and I'm going to be guiding you in a very fluid way of doing Tonglen that's not too rigid around what kind of suffering you're or who you're practicing for. To stay with a kind of embodied attunement to suffering and inviting into your practice whatever suffering comes up in your mind or in your body, that you invite that into the practice, okay? So I have my gong here. We'll sit for just a couple of minutes, and then I'll be guiding you through 4 stages of Tonglen practice. The most important stage is stage 3. And so we'll move rather quickly through stage 1 and stage 2, since you have had experience with Tonglen in the past. You can view this as a kind of refresher. And then in stage 3, we're going to spend some time staying fluidly with the situation. I wanted to add Jacqueline's entry as well. Emotional suffering, loss, several friends and a sister not from COVID. We all carry with us a variety of sufferings that we live with, that we encounter, and let's practice for what we see in the chat box as well. If you run out of ideas, just click on the chat box and include the chat box entries in your practice today. Okay, so I'm going to ring the gong and we'll sit for just a few minutes, and then we'll go into stage 1. I'm allowing some time at the end for us to discuss the practice. If there's any questions you may have, we can talk about them then. And so if you can sit with mindfulness of breathing, light-handed, spacious presence, and in your sitting practice, let the desire to engage suffering and help those who are suffering, including yourself, feel the desire to help begin to arise in these few minutes of sitting. And so we'll begin Tonglen. And in this first stage of Tonglen, we feel the incredible spaciousness of the mind and of our experience. The ability to embrace and encompass many suffering situations without freaking out. There's a fundamental spaciousness at the heart of our experience that we tap into. And the heart of that spaciousness is tenderness, resonance, a quality of tremendous kindness, desire to be of help in the world. And now we move into stage 2, where we're going to contemplate with our breathing. As we breathe in heavy, hot, and dark. We breathe out light, clear, and cool. So every in-breath, heavy, hot, dark. Every out-breath, light, clear, and cool. And just stay with that for a little while, setting the texture of the practice. The image that Naropa's founder used is you see yourself as an air purifier in a smoky, stale room. With every in-breath, breathing in the fetid, smoky, stale air. Through every pore of your body, you're breathing in through every pore of your body, into your heart center, breathing out through every pore of your body, light, clear, and cool. It's important to remember both the in-breath and the out-breath, not holding the in-breath in, not going out with the out-breath and not breathing again. Keep breathing the rhythm. Heavy, hot, and dark through every pore of the body. Light, clear, and cool through every pore of the body. And as we continue this, we feel strengthening of our ability to be present with suffering, the strengthening of our ability to offer what is good and needed to those who are suffering, including ourselves. And allow yourself to feel supported by the others on this Zoom call who are also practicing. We support each other to do this practice. If at any point in stage 3 you lose track, come back to stage 2 and reset the pattern. Heavy, hot, dark, breathing in, light, clear, and cool, breathing out. And we move to stage 3. In stage 3, we bring into our mind space whatever suffering we were thinking about before we began. Whether it's the suffering, physical suffering, psychological suffering, or existential suffering of ourselves or of others, of people in your community. Start with something specific, a specific scenario, important that it not be too general. So if it's a family member who's suffering, visualize that family member in front of you and visualize their suffering and immediately breathe in on your in-breath the suffering that they're experiencing and breathe out to them relief, kindness, support, a sense of relief from suffering. If it's illness of someone you know, someone's father has COVID, breathe in their COVID symptoms, breathe them right in, and breathe out relief, help in breathing, help in feeling well, help in feeling supported. So whatever suffering you encounter, you breathe in the suffering of that situation, whether it's your own or another person's. You breathe out whatever is needed to relieve that suffering. And we'll continue with that for a little while, and then I'll be encouraging you to move to other suffering situations as well. So again, something specific, nothing too general. The last conversation you had with someone, the last sight you had of them, the last encounter over Zoom or in person. Breathe in their suffering. Breathe out relief that you can offer to help them. You can work with their physical suffering, their psychological suffering, their existential suffering. If you're practicing for yourself, you could visualize yourself in front and you're looking in a mirror at yourself. Breathe in your own suffering into this body. Breathe out to the reflected body, relief from whatever suffering you're experiencing. If you find that the person you're practicing for is experiencing some kind of relief, you could actually see them having relief. Identify another fresh source of suffering. Let your mind be like a heat-seeking missile going toward whatever suffering you have in the field of your experience, and feel free to just move to the next suffering situation. You may have an associated thought or sense of another person. You may have a different topic of suffering for the person you're practicing for. Let yourself literally be drawn to suffering and breathe it in. Breathe it right in and breathe out the cool, the healing, whatever is needed for support and relief. As you breathe in the suffering of the other person, let it touch your heart. Feel your heart break a little bit as you breathe out relief and healing to the person you're practicing for. The crack in the heartbreak opens space for more love and care to be shared. And again, as we will continue this stage of the practice for about another 5 to 7 minutes, let yourself fluidly go to whatever kind of suffering that you feel is fresh, that you feel that you perhaps have not addressed yet in your own life, in the life of others near you or far. Again, continuing to breathe in the suffering, feeling the suffering as it comes in, and let it really touch and open your heart. Breathe out healing, relief, kindness, support, care. If you find that you're drifting off and forgetting to practice, just notice that and come back. If you find yourself resisting the practice and you don't want to do this practice, then do Tonglen for yourself, breathing in your resistance to the practice and breathing out care and kindness. It's no problem. It's okay. This can be a tough practice, being gentle with ourselves. And again, if you run out of subjects to practice for, allow yourself to click into the chat box and choose one of the sharings from people in this group and do Tonglen for that suffering. Now, as we move into stage 4 of the practice, we're going to extend this practice out to more and more people, less specific situations. And so we'll begin and we'll do this extending out geographically. If you could call to mind some COVID-related suffering, perhaps teachers, perhaps nurses, perhaps first responders, or COVID patients in hospitals, choose one of these groups to do practice for. And we'll continue to do Tonglen. In my case, I'm going to pick nurses, for example, caring for COVID patients. And let's start with in our community, our immediate community, our town, or the portion of a city we're living in the countryside where we're living, we're going to start doing Tonglen for that particular group of people who are suffering with COVID, breathing in their despair, their exhaustion, their burnout, their fear, all of the things that are going on, breathing in the pain that they're experiencing, breathing out kindness, soothing, relief, a sense of sympathy and empathy and compassion. And we'll do a couple of breaths for this particular group in our immediate area. Again, through every pore of the body, breathing in the suffering, breathing out the relief. And then we'll extend to your county or your city or your region, all the people in this category, in my case, nurses, all the nurses caring for COVID patients in long-term care facilities and hospitals, breathing in their difficulty, their burnout, their fear, their constant exposure to sickness, and breathe out care, kindness, concern, healing to them. And again, continue through some breathing. All of those people in your region who are experiencing this. And then extend out a little further into a larger region. I'm going to include caregivers of COVID patients in prisons, in jails, in all kinds of facilities in my part of Colorado along the Front Range, breathing in their suffering and breathing out care and kindness, wishes for their safety and their health, appreciation for all they've given. And then we'll just continue. If you can extend out every few breaths, extend out geographically a little further from where you are. I'm going to extend now to the Rocky Mountain West, but for those of you in other parts of the country, to the region of the country you live in, if you're abroad, and I know one person here at least is abroad, in the region of the country you're living in, all the people who are experiencing this suffering, breathing in their suffering, breathing out kindness, care. And we'll continue just a few minutes more with every breath, extending further to other countries. Thinking about, in my case, I'm thinking about nurses in healthcare systems that are really ineffective, unable to care for everyone sick. Everyone in the Western Hemisphere, overwhelmed nurses everywhere, North America, Central America, and South America, breathing in their suffering, even though it's only a tiny touch, just acknowledging all the suffering going on, breathing out care and kindness. And then begin to extend that care all the way around the globe to people in many other countries, people with complete economic collapse, with dictators that don't care at all about the welfare of their people, about healthcare systems that are deprived of any kind of way to help COVID patients. We breathe in their suffering and we breathe out care, concern, and kindness for them. So just another couple of minutes of this practice. And at this point, we'll return to sitting practice for a few minutes, letting go of the whole contemplation of Tonglen, and sit with the after effect of this practice, the expansiveness, the heartbroken tenderness, the openness that comes from Tonglen practice. And we'll just sit with this for a few minutes. Thank you. And we could have a discussion of the practice. Any questions or observations or whatever you'd like to share. And if it's small enough group, just unmute yourself and speak. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, and I want to say that I'm going to stop the recording because I want everyone to feel comfortable saying whatever they want to say and turn their cameras on if they are, which I totally understand, not comfortable being recorded. So I'm going to turn that off right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Stacy.